what we've heard from Trump, 60% tariffs on China specifically, 10% for everybody else. So when we're looking at who's most affected, how do we kind of suss it out?
This is a massive, massive implications for a whole range of companies that are heavily exposed to China, and companies, as we know, are scrambling. And the real question is how much of their manufacturing is dependent on China, and then how essential is the part of their manufacturing dependent on China to their supply chains.
And so, Isaac, so let's say you're some consumer-oriented American company. You're relying on China, you're maybe a bit concerned. What's your move here? What is your response?
The move is to better price out your exposure to China, run the numbers very, very carefully, and decide, do I want to go against what my customers want and what my US government wants and really double down on China, or do I want to really seek to diversify away from a China that's becoming less friendly to American businesses, but also becoming much more of a regulatory hotspot?
Isaac, why haven't more companies diversified already? We went through this once before. The global economy is becoming sort of less of a duopoly over time. What are they waiting for?
That's a great question. So we track this very closely, and we expect at some point the other shoe to drop, but it really hasn't yet. And we think that's in part because of the strength still of the domestic Chinese market, in part because of the idea that companies think they can manufacture in China for China, in part because companies think, hey, this is going to change, and that the last 10 years are just going to disappear. And then in part because companies are afraid of reprisal and afraid of what's going to happen to their people and their supplies in Beijing if they move too actively.
Well, how much have things changed? I mean, when you look at the number of U.S. multinationals that are manufacturing in China, whether it's for export or domestic there, how's the shift been over time?
So one of the problems with quantifying the exposure is supply chain data is very poor, and companies will often say, oh, these are the number of factories we have in China, but we're talking to a retail CEO who said, well, we had, say, 100 factories and only 4 were in China, but the 4 did 60% of our business. And so it's really hard to quantify based on the numbers. We've seen some high-profile companies like Steve Madden, like Stellantis, which makes Jeeps, say that they're going to reduce their China exposure, but still for the majors, the Apples and the Microsofts of the world and the Boeings, haven't moved all that much.
Let's say, Isaac, Trump really means it, and we really do see tariffs of 60% on all Chinese goods. You would expect Beijing to respond and react how?
Great question. Beijing likes to respond asymmetrically, and so they will bluster, but they'll also punish certain American companies, and possibly even companies that are very close to Trump or companies that hate Trump and have been active against them. They like to do it in a way that there's plausible deniability. There's a famous case about 5 years ago with a South Korean company that had a link to the South Korean military, and Beijing responded very, very harshly against them, even though the link was fairly tenuous. So we could expect to see something like that and keep American companies on their toes.
It's interesting when you look at the goals of these tariffs or export controls or what have you, it seems to be twofold. One is to get Americans a better deal on stuff, right? And also to sort of advantage American industries against China or whatever countries you may have. Did it work well the first time, and will it work with a higher magnitude of tariffs?
It's a great question. So there's Trump's goals and there's his people's goals. And Trump's goals are tariffs for tariff's sake, because tariffs are good for America, because they bring jobs back. All that's debatable, but that's Trump's views. A lot of the people around him do honestly seem to feel that the US and China are preparing for war, and that we need to reduce the economic exposure to China because the countries are too coupled with each other, which will make war fighting far more disastrous.
Wow.
Isaac, we've been talking a lot today about Trump's pick for Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. What do we know about how Mr. Bessent thinks about China?
We don't know very much. He had a Fox News op-ed recently where he called the Chinese regime despotic, which is stronger language than I think any Treasury Secretary has used in the past several decades. And Soros has long been quite hawkish on China. Would you look broadly at Trump's cabinet? I mean, whether it's Stefanik or Waltz or Rubio, and say, I mean, what does that tell you about Trump's position and strategy toward China? How it could very much differ from Biden's? He is a lot more aggressive on the picks this time than in 2016. It's really a continuity from where Biden was. Rubio especially is very respected on both sides, and I almost hate to say that out loud because I don't want to get him in trouble, but he is bipartisan, and we really like the work that he does and the way that he focuses on the Chinese Communist Party and also the way that he differentiates that from the Chinese people. We think that's very important. Some of his other picks are, as we all know, less serious, but certainly the folks in the national security realm are really saying and seemingly doing a lot of the right things as it comes to China.
Isaac, I want to go back to the war comment you made a few moments ago. This administration, then, the picks that he has made, does it make war more likely with an adversary like China? Or is it sort of make it less likely if you're preparing for potential that you can avoid it?
It's the $10 trillion question.
Yeah.
So Trump is less likely to go to war than Harris. Trump is more of an isolationist and more likely to make a deal with Beijing over Taiwan. Everyone that we've just mentioned in the cabinet would almost certainly push very hard against that. And the question probably will be, if Beijing, say, tries to take Taiwan or launches missiles over the Taiwan Strait, what is his mood? Who has talked to him last? How does he want to respond in that day? And it's going to be very much on his personality, on his feeling at that time.